United States President Donald Trump has written an open letter to the NATO membership criticizing them for much of their behavior towards the conflict with Russia. This open correspondence also exposes the Liberal government as being both bad managers and not being honest with the Canadian population. Welcome back to the Canadian Shield. My name is Sterling. We're going to be talking about Donald Trump's open letter to NATO and how it exposes not only a lot of fractures, but a lot of inability for NATO to actually respond to the threat of Russia. Poland had some drones cross into their airspace. There are some that are insisting that the drones were hacked and they were sent into Poland to try to initiate a problem with NATO. Of course, there are many layers and it goes deeper than that. And I don't know one way or another if Russia just did it on purpose or if it was somebody trying to cause a lot of problems. We're going to cover the underlying issue, especially when it pertains to energy and heating and all of the stuff that much of Europe receives from the Russian oil reserves, and how the government of Canada has been deceiving Canadians about the need and the demand for all of our fossil fuels, not only in Asia, but in Europe, and how our fossil fuels could actually bring all of the money that the Europeans are sending into Russia, sending it into Canada. However, before we get into that, I want to do some shout outs for people that gave me super thanks. So I'm going to say these super thanks in the way that I saw them on the screen, and that's the order. It's not about anything other than that. And I want everyone in the Shield Wall and those of you that are not subscribed or members to understand that I appreciate all of the support that you give me, that I have an email address if you want to send me something in, or suggest a topic or ask me to cover a story or two. And I just want to give my thanks to everyone who supports me and helps me out. I think that I don't know that I'm articulate enough to express to you my appreciation. So let's start with the McAvee 9015 gave $6.99 and said thanks. Now, I'll be honest with you, almost everybody said thanks. So I think that must be a feature, like when you make the super thanks, it must be just, you must be allowed to say that like automatically. However, that doesn't change the fact that I appreciate them saying thanks and that I also am very thankful for their support. Next, we come to Mary Lou Cleveland, 6991, who gave $13.99 and said thanks. I thank you very much in return. Shelley Croak, $6.99, who said thanks. I thank you. Ruth H9B gave $50 and said thanks. Now, Ruth also said that she doesn't agree with Mark Carney having an unlimited credit card. And I have to agree with you, Ruth. I think that one of the things that when we can finally get these nightmare liberals out of the way is we need to have more checks and balances in place for the government and our money. Philly Arc 5767 gave $20 and said thanks. I thank you very much. Mary Lou Cleveland 6991 gave an additional $13.99, and I want to say thank you for your generosity. I appreciate it very much. I'm glad you enjoy the content. Cindy Wilson 2739, a longtime supporter of mine, gave $6.99. I want to say thank you in return. And Like Life 7061 gave $104.99, which I find to be extremely generous. They said thanks, and I say thank you in return. Okay, so now that we've taken care of that, I want to encourage all of you to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, share this channel with all of your socials. Let's get into this. We'll open with what got it started, and the wording is what makes me realize how badly Canada is governing its people and its country. And you have to ask yourself, is it intentional or is it just incompetence? Either way, they're not qualified by my reasoning. Donald Trump wrote this letter to all NATO nations, a letter sent by President Donald Trump to all NATO nations and the world. Quote, I am ready to do major sanctions on Russia when all NATO nations have agreed and started to do the same thing, and when all NATO nations stop buying oil from Russia. We're going to come back to that. That's extremely important for Canada. As you know, NATO's commitment to win has been far less than 100%. The purchase of Russian oil by some has been shocking. It greatly weakens your negotiating position and bargaining power over Russia. Anyway, I am ready to go, quote unquote, when you are. I believe that this, plus NATO as a group placing 50 to 100% tariffs on China, to be fully withdrawn after the war with Russia and Ukraine is ended, will also be of a great help in ending this deadly but ridiculous war. China has a strong control and even grip over Russia, and these powerful tariffs will break that grip. This is not Trump's war. It would never have started if I was president. It is Biden and Zelensky's war. I am only here to help stop it and save thousands of Russian and Ukrainian lives. 7,118 lives were lost this week alone, which he calls crazy. If NATO does as I say, the war will end quickly and all those lives will be saved. If not, you are just wasting my time and the time, energy, and money of the United States. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Donald J. Trump, President of the United States of America. Now, there's a lot to unpack in that statement. I can see what Donald Trump's position and what his point is. Why are we wasting our time sending billions of dollars to Russia for their oil when we could be giving it to other places? And of course, the reason for that is pretty simple. They have the pipelines to those countries. And you might wonder in your mind, well, why is it that those countries have those pipelines? That's a very great question, and I'm going to answer that for you. Before I tear apart our Canadian government and its lack of movement on selling our resources into Europe to counter the big bad Vladimir Putin, who in one breath, Mark Carney will tell you is this big evil guy. No problem. We're going to send billions of Canadian dollars into Ukraine. We might even put boots on the ground, but for some reason, we won't interfere with Vladimir Putin's ability to earn money off of that very same region. Seems a little bit suspect, in my opinion. Okay, quick history lesson for context so that we can understand what's happening today. We have to touch base on it or we will never understand what's going on right now. In 1945 in Germany, the Second World War came to an end when the Russian and the Allied armies met in Berlin. What's left out of the talk, what's left out of the discussion, what's often overlooked is the two opposing ideologies. When Russian armies came across what's known as Eastern Europe, they brought with them an ideology of Marxism, of socialism, of communism. They were technically known as the USSR, the United Soviet Socialist Republic. Socialist Republic. They brought with them communism that had been in place since the end of the First World War for the Russians, so 1917. Because nobody had an appetite for war, except for Winston Churchill did point that they would be a problem, but everybody else was just tired of fighting. They were trying to rebuild their countries. Nobody took the time to worry about all of the communist governments that were being propped up all over Eastern Europe by the influence of the USSR. And on a side note, that's important to remember for those of you out there that are trying to convince yourself that socialism works. It does not work. This was a cluster of countries that took over half of Europe, and they were flat broke. I remember it. I was there, it was part of my lifestyle. They were flat broke. Socialism doesn't work, guys. All right, so if we come forward a little bit to when countries are finally starting to stabilize, we have East Berlin and West Berlin. It's the beginning of the Cold War, and we have NATO being formed and drafted. As a counter to NATO, we have what's called the Warsaw Pact. And you can see here of this map that I have of 1955, NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. All of the countries in blue are in NATO, and all of the countries in red are in the Warsaw Pact. And if you look closely at West and East Germany, in Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, you can understand that they were part of the USSR. Well, they were part of the Warsaw Pact. They were communist governments, and they were in very deep with the USSR. Now, that's very, very relevant because much of the pipelines that we're talking about were placed to feed these countries. The Warsaw Pact of 1955 didn't come apart until essentially 1991, when the wall between East and West Germany was torn down as a symbolic destruction of the of the Warsaw Pact and of a cascade of governments being taken from socialist and communist and turned into capitalist. appreciate that the Warsaw Pact in 1991 was flat broke. Some of these countries that you see today are some of the wealthiest countries in Europe. And anybody out there trying to convince you otherwise need only look at the history of this particular conflict, of this particular group of countries, to understand just how poorly socialism will improve your life. Because these are currently some of the wealthiest countries on earth, and yet when they were all together under socialist governments, they were flat broke. And their people were standing in line. Oh, I'm telling you, I'll do a different video on the troubles and the issues that surround socialism. However, it did make for some very great spy movies, and we got to call it the Cold War, where both NATO and the Warsaw Pact were essentially spying on one another as best as they could, and spawned a bunch of movies and really good television shows. And many of you might be out there asking yourself what my point is, and I'm glad you asked. So if we take a look at this map, you will see these green lines. And I apologize for the consistency of the map. It's just the best one that I could find. Those green lines that are all crisscrossing across Europe, that all come back to the Black Sea, which of course is historically under the control of the Black Sea Fleet of Russia, a semi-independent body. Those green lines are pipelines that were put in place by Russia to supply oil from Russia and parts of the USSR to the Warsaw Pact, to various countries that are no longer participating in the Warsaw Pact, that became capitalist countries. And Russia included became a capitalist country. They still were providing a lot of oil and all of the other things that come along with that to these countries. These pipelines, which are very expensive to build, which have been in place, and some of these have been in place since the 50s that you saw that map. And they go all the way into Germany. And then, of course, the pipeline was in Germany, and they just continued it along the way onto the western side of Germany. They go into, as you can see, they make their way nearly to Italy. They make their way into Poland. They cover Hungary. They cover the Slovaks and Czech republics. The Russians have had oil production in there since before the German Workers' Party came into authority. So there's a lot of oil development that has been going on there, and they laid these pipelines down so that they could supply these countries of the Warsaw Pact with the resources they need to power their vehicles and turn on their lights and all the other things that you still hear about today. And that's the issue. That's the problem, guys. Warsaw Pact might have collapsed, but NATO did not. NATO still stands there as a line of defense against what is today known as the Russian Federation. Now, those pipelines are still being utilized because they were the ones that were in place. They're the ones that have the product. Like I said to you, the Russian oil manufacturing was in place when World War II started. They had a lot of oil being manufactured. And as a result, they were able to supply the various countries. They built the pipeline. One of them is 4,000 kilometers long. I mean, that's half the length of Canada. That's half the length of the Canada-US border. That's a pipeline that's pretty big. Now, understand that over the years, all of this gas has been flowing in, and some of these pipelines cross Ukraine. Ukraine has turned them off, so Hungary isn't mad about that. Many of them, however, are in the water. So they come out of the Black Sea or they come out of the Baltic, and they continue on their merry way, and they provide, I'll say fossil fuels to various countries, say Poland, Germany, and other destinations. And this is what, you hear Donald Trump talking about, that the American supply for oil is amping up. And I'm sure that it's very American focused what he's talking about, and how the Chinese are putting a lot of pressure so that the countries really shouldn't be putting sanctions on Russia. They should be putting sanctions on the Chinese. They don't want to do that, of course, because all of their manufacturing is in China. They don't want to do that because of the quasi-socialist governments, just like the liberal government in Canada doesn't want to take on China. They don't have the courage, you see. And that's the nature of Donald Trump's letter. He's mocking all of them because they're not being serious about what war looks like. They're not fighting the fight. They're demanding sacrifices from you and I while they go ahead and keep everything at the status quo. and understand that this supply of oil that we could cut off at any time if Canada simply started to provide all of the products and all of the resources that we have buried in Alberta. Oh, of course, the problem is that the Liberal government won't let us take it out of the ground. The Liberal government says there's no demand for it, and yet Europe is paying their enemy money so that he can wage a war against our very own money. I mean, imagine in your mind that Germany is sending millions and billions of dollars, or Poland or any of these other countries that are sending all of this money into Russia as they purchase their oil. And the Russians are now able to take that money and turn that into weapons that they're purchasing from, let's say, China. And then they are utilizing those very same things against Canadian resources that are on the ground, whether that be money, whether that be equipment, whether that be people, in the Ukraine. And as I think we can all agree now that you hear it out loud, that makes no sense. We actually should be having all of that money funneled to Canada, except for, of course, the Liberal government is in the way. Their ideology is in the way. They want to tell themselves that they're going to get statues built to them. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is drinking fossil fuels to the point where it's a never-ending need for it. Canada has much of the ability to solve that problem, and all that's in the way is a handful of Canadians who call themselves the Liberal Party, who are stopping the productivity, who are stopping the improvement of Canada, who are in fact stopping the ability to come to peace in the Ukraine by their actions, by their refusal to pull those products out of the ground, by their refusal to get started on any of the infrastructure projects that it requires. Because these pipelines have been in place for many, many years, for many, in some cases, decades. And they are supplying that oil, and the countries that are along those pipelines are relying on the supply of oil or fossil fuels that the Russian country is providing. So Canada could be displacing that oil. Never mind displacing all of the other concerns, all of the other bad places that happen. Let's ignore China. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that our government doesn't even have the foresight to understand that by not getting our fuel out of the ground, we are in fact assisting Russia in its war. We are part of the Russian war machine by not allowing our products to be taken out of the ground, by getting in the way, interfering, blocking, and trying to tell the Canadian people that they're doing it for some environmental concerns, and that they somehow feel that it's their right to impose themselves upon the will of the people. They are in fact assisting Russia in its fight against Ukraine. By not taking on China, by not bringing our productivity and our productions back to Canada and paying Canadian wages for these products, they are in fact assisting Russia in Ukraine. I mean, I'm not making it up. It's simple and straightforward logic. Now, if we were to get some liquefaction plants built, get some pipelines built, we could maybe stop the Russian economy. The Russian economy would need to look elsewhere to sell its products. And all of the dictators or all of the bad men of the world would have to look elsewhere, because the world would be relying on clean, efficient, ethical Canadian LNG, Canadian fossil fuels. Of course, the Liberal government doesn't seem to be aware of that. For all of their talk about the world and the global stage and all the rest of it, either, like as I said at the beginning, either they are unaware of it, which makes them not qualified to lead, or they are aware of it and they are intentionally ignoring it, which of course also makes them not qualified to lead. And if they are in fact that intentionally doing it, if they are in fact designing it to be this way, they are culpable in the conflict in Ukraine. They are culpable in all of the other conflicts that are fueled by combat oil. Of course, I'm not sure that people that are supporting the Liberal Party want to look at it that way, but obviously that's the way we must be considering it. Obviously, we cannot think of it in any other shape. It is exactly as I lay out. The more that we stop ourselves from supplying our product to the rest of the earth, the more harm happens. The Canadian oil will dislodge all kinds of bad product. The Canadian fossil fuels, the Canadian liquid LNG will dislodge all kinds of dictators. And with that dislodgement, with the capitalism that comes along with that, we will export freedom. We will export prosperity. We will export livelihoods And we will change the course of millions of billions, in fact, I dare say, people's lives. We will improve on the ground the average, ordinary, everyday human being through this ability of ours to get this clean product out of the ground and ensure that we are selling it to people that are behaving, to governments that behave in a way that we see fit. In a way that makes sure that the people that they govern are being looked after properly. Of course, the Liberal government doesn't seem to care about any of that. They only seem to care about carbon. And now they want to tell us that our houses are no good. I mean, where does it end? It never ends with a zealot. You see, that's the thing. They started with cars and now they're coming into your attic. Anyway, I'll cover that in a different video. I'm going to wrap here. I want to encourage all of you to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, share this with all your socials. Thank you for listening. I'll talk to you next time.